Chapter 1. Echoes of Defeat. The forest stank of blood, rot, and splintered bark. Smoke coiled like dying serpents through the air, thick with the iron tang of gore and the sickly sweet reek of sap. Corpses, both beast and tree, lay strewn like discarded totems across the desecrated glade. A wounded sky, bruised and gray with churning storm clouds, cast a grim pall over the massacre below. Thunder cracked in the distance, not in triumph, but like the gnashing of an ancient god's teeth. At the center of the carnage, a figure rose slowly, half standing, half slumped against a shattered boulder etched with crude chaos runes. Ghorvak One-Horn, Beastlord of the Ghorvak herd, once the alpha of Drakewald's wrath, now looked more like a carcass draped in ruin than a creature of dominance. His left horn, jagged and blood-caked, had been snapped in half. It jutted from his head like the last broken tooth of a dying predator. His chest was torn open in 3 ragged gashes, each as wide as a man's axe, weeping black blood and matted fur. He did not groan, he did not cry out. He growled, a low guttural sound like a wounded mountain echoing through its own tomb. Around him, his warband lay in ruin. Dozens of gores and bestigaras, limbs twisted at unnatural angles, eyes wide and glassy in the dirt. A minotaur twitched, pinned to the earth by a root thick as a wagon axle driven straight through its chest. It had been a rout, not a battle. Not even a skirmish. A lesson. He remembered it in flashes, the earth splitting open, roots shooting upward like javelins of ironwood, skewering his warriors mid-charge, limbs made of bark as dense as fortress gates, smashing through flesh and bone with contemptuous ease. The sound of laughter, ancient, deep, and vegetal, like wind howling through a canyon of graves. Vrrangal. The name wasn't spoken so much as felt, etched into the minds of those who had witnessed the Verdant warden in motion. Not a Treeman, not merely a tree spirit, but something far older. A sentinel of the forest's first vengeance. Towering above the treetops, his crown a snarl of living branches thick with screeching crows and whispering leaves. His body, gnarled and green-black, moved with unnatural speed, eyes of molten amber glowing with wrath that transcended language. Ghorvak remembered leaping at him, swinging his gore-iron axe, striking bark that might as well have been steel, and then darkness. He blinked. Blood trickled into his left eye. He did not wipe it away. He pushed himself upright on trembling legs, muscles screaming. One hand still gripped the haft of his shattered weapon. The head snapped clean from the shaft. Useless. Around him, the glade was silent. No birds, no insects. Just the creaking moan of the wind through ruined limbs and broken horns. A stillness so absolute it mocked the chaos that had come before. He turned his head slowly toward a single figure dragging itself forward. Vrrangal, his gored champion. The left side of his face was gone, jawbone exposed, an eye hanging like a wet seed from a burst fruit. He crawled through mud slick with blood and offal, lips moving wordlessly. Ghorvak staggered toward him. Vrrangal's fingers clawed the air. "My lord, the herd, he shattered." A root burst from the ground without warning, snaking around Vrrangal's throat like a living garrote. The warrior's final breath came out in a wet gurgle as he was yanked backward into the soil. No scream, just a choking rattle, then nothing. The ground swallowed him whole. Ghorvak did not move. His single eye stared at the spot, blood still trickling down his cheek. His breath came in ragged snarls, each exhale thick with hate. He was not afraid. He was furious. Pain laced every inch of him, but within that agony, something deeper burned. something cold and jagged. The memory of that laugh, that gaze, that dismissive swat that had flung him 20 paces and left his warband shattered like twigs. He would return, not for victory, not for glory, or revenge. He turned, dragging his maimed body through the glade, past the corpse of his Bray shaman, skull crushed like an overripe fruit, past a Bestiger impaled upon his own banner, past the altar they had erected, now snapped in half like a brittle bone. His gait was uneven, monstrous, more beast than man. His shadow stretched long behind him as thunder rolled overhead once more. He did not look back. This was no retreat. It was the beginning of the hunt, and Ghorvak One-Horn would make the forest bleed. Chapter 2. The Totem Burns. The flames were already licking skyward by the time the first skull cracked open. Ghorvak stood silent at the edge of the pyre, his broad, blood-caked shoulders rising and falling with each heaving breath. Around him the Ghorrimal herd howled, their voices thick with bloodlust and the echo of recent slaughter. The dead were still warm. Steam hissed off the carcasses of fallen rivals as flesh curled from bone beneath the blaze. Bones popped, eyes boiled. The stench was divine. He raised his axe, no longer shattered, now reforged with jagged shards of metal and blackwood, fashioned from the remains of his lost warriors, and hammered into shape with brute strength and molten rage. The weapon pulsed with raw hate, a bastard fusion of ruin and remembrance. Before him, the sacred totem of the Ironhorn tribe stood impaled in the mud. A towering effigy of bestial pride carved from old oak and lashed with sinew and bone, its top adorned with the polished skull of the former Beastlord Kargok Steelfang. His legacy had stood unchallenged for 5 winters, until tonight. The Ironhorns had refused Ghorvak's summons, refused to join his vengeance, mocked his wounds, called his defeat shameful, called him broken. A Beastlord with 1 horn was no Beastlord, they had whispered. Now they were meat. Their camp had been razed with unholy fury. The initial charge had been thunder, hoofbeats pounding through the trees, war cries curdling the very mist. Gors had screamed praises to the dark gods as they tore through the palisades. The Ironhorn defenders had been slow, arrogant, drunk on their own delusions of strength. Ghorvak had descended upon them like famine incarnate. He remembered the moment he had driven his axe into Kargok's groin, lifting the squealing wretch into the air, watching the weight of his body tear itself apart from the inside. Entrails spilled like wet rope onto the altar stones. His final scream had been high and pathetic. The Ghorrimal herd laughed as they bathed in it. Now Kargok's skull had been torn from its pedestal. Ghorvak clutched it in one clawed hand, raising it to the moonlight like an offering to darker forces. "Strength is not what you boast," he roared, his voice thick and gravelly, scar tissue tightening around his ruined jaw. "Strength is what you leave behind in ruin." The warband erupted. Clubs and cleavers pounded shields. Drums of stretched human skin boomed with frenzied rhythm. A minotaur bellowed so loudly the trees shook. Ghorvak slammed the skull into the totem with such force that bone shattered and splinters burst outward like shrapnel. Then he drove his axe into the base, splitting the effigy in half. A gout of blood, not sap but true, hot blood, spewed from the wood, hissing as it touched the fire. The forest itself seemed to flinch. He turned to face his herd. Dozens of Gors, mouths frothing, eyes wide with fanatical hunger. Bestigors, tall and broad, stained in red from horn to hoof. Minotaurs, chests heaving, their chains now ornamented with flayed faces. At their center stood the Bray shaman, Morgric Black Tongue, swathed in a patchwork cloak of skin and crow feathers, eyes rolled back in an opium-fueled trance, chanting low and foul. They move east. Ghorvak growled. Back into the forest. We bleeded dry. A murmur ran through the herd. Not fear. Anticipation. One of the younger Ghors stepped forward, body twitching with eagerness. "My lord, the forest, it took us before. It—" The words died with a crunch. Ghorvak's axe arced sideways in a blur, opening the Ghur's throat like a burst wineskin. Blood sprayed in a wide arc, painting the grass in black-red streaks. The youth fell, twitching, eyes wide in disbelief. "No more doubt," Ghorvak snarled. "Only blood." He stared into the fire, now consuming the totem in full. The flames twisted, forming shapes that danced and writhed, shapes that looked almost like roots, like long fingers reaching out from beyond the veil. The wind howled through the clearing, hot and angry. Somewhere a tree cracked and fell, as if in mourning. Murgrek stepped forward, voice still in chant. "You would awaken it, Ghorvak. The Verdant Warden does not forget. It will come again." "I want it to," Ghorvak whispered. The fire reached its peak then, and the smoke curled into the night sky, carrying with it the scent of vengeance, sacrifice, and the promise of war. Above, the stars flickered uneasily, and in the east, beyond the hills, the forest watched and waited. Chapter 3. Chapter 3. Blood Moon Pact. The moon rose red. Not crimson like the blush of dusk, not pink like lovers' lips in spring. No, this was a predator's red, a butcher's hue, the color of rage made manifest in the sky, casting its hateful light across the warband gathered beneath the jagged spires of the ancient altar. It stood alone in a clearing carved from the bones of centuries, a stone slab crusted in old gore, moss slicked and etched with unholy runes worn by time and blood alike. The air was thick with incense, though not of flowers or spices, but of burning hair, of blistered skin, of marrow turned to smoke. Around it the Ghoramaw herd circled, swaying, snarling, some rutting in blood-mad frenzy, others daubing symbols of chaos onto their own flesh with bone knives and broken nails. Above, carrion birds wheeled in anticipation, their shrieks drowned by the pulsing beat of skin drums and the rhythmic clash of iron against bone. Ghorvak stood at the altar's apex, towering over the herd, breath steaming in the cold night, chest slick with sweat and blood. He had not slept since the raising of the iron horns. His wounds, bound with rusted chains and filth-soaked rags, still oozed black, but he felt no pain, only purpose, only fury. Before him knelt the Chosen, 3 captives, stripped and bound, their limbs stretched and nailed to the roots of the altar. One was a human, a Bretonnian knight stripped of his armor and dignity, flesh pale and quivering. Another, a rival Ghor who had dared question the hunt. The third, a creature barely recognizable, some elf spawn caught spying on the warband's march. Its eyes still held defiance. Ghorvak would savor crushing that last ember. Morgwuk Blacktongue loomed nearby, his staff crowned with a bundle of twitching rat tails and desiccated tongues. His mouth moved in constant muttering, words older than man or beast, syllables thick with spite. The Bray Shaman raised his arms, clawed fingers reaching skyward. "On this moon, the pact is struck," he intoned, voice a wet rasp, as if dragged from the throat of a drowned corpse. "The forest will know our name, The gods will taste our gift, blood for vision, flesh for fury." Ghorvak stepped forward. His axe, newly anointed in the fire of the Ironhorn pyres, gleamed dully in the red moonlight. He began with the gore. No ceremony, just a downward hack that split the beast from shoulder to hip, ribcage exploding outward in a fan of blood. The heart bounced once on the stone before he scooped it up and bit into it with teeth like cracked iron. The warband roared. Next came the elf. Ghorvak carved slowly, methodically, skinning flesh from face with the tip of his blade while Morgrak poured black ichor into its eyes, chanting names not meant for mortal throats. The elf screamed until its voice was gone, then convulsed as its soul was drawn through a rusted horn and fed to the altar. The stones glowed, faintly at first, then blazed with sickly green fire. The night was last. He wept, he begged. In 3 tongues he pleaded for mercy, none of which Ghorvak understood, nor cared to. With a snarl he seized the man's jaw and wrenched it wide, too wide until bones snapped and tendons shrieked. He poured boiling blood down the knight's throat, then slit it open and let him drown in his own ruin. Silence fell. The fire dimmed, the drums ceased, and the forest spoke, not with words, with presence. A wave of pressure that flattened the grass, bent the trees inward, sent birds screaming into the night. The altar groaned, roots writhed up from beneath it, wrapping around the corpses and dragging them below, like a greedy hand claiming its feast. Morgrak collapsed, seizing, foam pouring from his mouth. Then he rose. His eyes bled black. His voice was not his own. "It comes," he croaked, throat stretched by another's will. The warden stirs. The grove awakens. The pact is bound. You march not as beasts, but as anathema. Ghorvak smiled, teeth glinting like tombstones in firelight. He stepped forward, raised his blood-caked axe to the red sky, and bellowed to the gods. The forest, the night, let it come. The warband screamed with him, howls of madness, stomps of hooves, chants of slaughter. The trees trembled. The moon seemed to flare. And somewhere deep in the heart of Athel Loren, something ancient opened its eyes and remembered Ghorvak's name. Chapter 4. Into the Verdant Hell. The trees closed behind them like a maw. Branches knitted together above the Goramaw herd, blotting out the blood-red moon and plunging the forest into an oppressive twilight. Roots twisted across the path like knotted sinews, slick with rot and moss, as if the very ground writhed in protest. Athel Loren did not welcome invaders. It remembered every boot that tread upon its sacred flesh, and it punished each one. Ghorvak led the charge, his hooves splashing through black puddles of stagnant water and decay. His breath steamed in the cold, rancid air. Around him his warriors marched in a tide of hunger and hatred, their weapons slick with dried blood, their eyes gleaming with the fever of the blood moon pact. But the forest was alive, not with birdsong or the buzz of insects. No, this was a darker symphony, the crackling of distant limbs breaking where no beast moved, the groaning of trunks too old for such movement, the whisper of leaves that did not rustle but murmured in voices once human, once elven, now stolen. The herd began to splinter. At first it was subtle. A Bestiger vanished between 2 trees, called away by a faint, sobbing voice that sounded like his long-dead mother. A Minotaur froze mid-step, head tilted, nostrils flaring. Then it turned and lumbered into the brush, frothing at the mouth, eyes wide in terror. It was gone before anyone could stop it. "Keep formation," Ghorvak barked, voice like thunder filtered through gravel. "If you break rank, you die in pieces." But the forest did not wait for weakness. Vines lashed from the trees, tipped with barbs and spines. One coiled around a young Ghor's throat, lifting him into the air. He thrashed, gurgled, and then his head snapped free from his body with a wet pop. The vine stuffed it into a yawning knothole, which sealed shut like a satisfied mouth. Another beast was swallowed whole when the earth beneath him crumbled, revealing a pit of brambles that skewered him in a dozen places before closing around him like a fist. His screams echoed for long minutes, then stopped abruptly. Still, they pressed forward. The deeper they went, the thicker the canopy became. The light faded into a wet, greenish murk. The trees grew closer, trunks bulging with cancerous knots that throbbed faintly. Some pulsed with visible veins, as if they fed on something more than soil and sun. The air stank of fungal bloom and corpse-sweet sap. Morgluk stumbled at Ghorvak's side, clutching his staff, his eyes unfocused, flecks of black vomit dripping from his lips. "It feeds on fear," the Bray shaman croaked. "It drinks from the roots of madness." "We feed it nothing," Ghorvak snarled. "We carve our names into its heart." Ahead, the forest parted into a glade. Silent, perfectly circular. In its center stood a stone monolith, black, slick with moss and streaked in what looked like ancient blood. Around it, the trees leaned in unnaturally, branches arched like ribs. No animals stirred. No insects crawled. The very air was still. A challenge. Ghorvak stepped into the glade, eyes locked on the monolith. He touched it and snarled. Visions poured into his mind like fire. Images of his herd slaughtered 1,000 ways, trees growing through their chests, roots bursting from their mouths. Vrrangal standing above them all, eyes alight with silent contempt. He howled and slammed his axe into the stone. It did not break. It did not even crack. But the forest screamed. The glade erupted. Roots tore from the ground like serpents, flailing wildly. One impaled a Ghor mid-charge, bursting through his back and lifting him into the air. Another ensnared a Beastlord, crushing his ribcage until his guts exploded from his mouth. Limbs of bark and thorn lashed from the trees, ripping flesh, severing limbs. Ghorvak spun in a cyclone of gore, axe flashing in the dim light. He cleaved a vine in half, then buried his blade into a writhing trunk that bled a thick green ichor. Morgluk called down dark blessings, shrieking blasphemies into the wind. The shadows trembled, and for a moment the roots recoiled. Then, as suddenly as it began, the assault ceased. The glade fell silent again. The monolith remained. Ghorvak, chest heaving, turned to his blood-slicked warriors. A dozen were gone. Dozens more bore wounds that would fester and never heal. But they had not broken. He raised his axe and roared. "The forest is no god. It bleeds." The warband echoed his cry, a bestial chorus of defiance that rolled through the trees like thunder. And deep beneath the roots something stirred, something old, something wrathful. The verdant hell had accepted their challenge. It would answer in kind. Chapter 5. The Beast Within. The screams came at dawn. Not the cries of battle or death, those the Ghorma herd knew well. No, these were other. High, broken, gurgling, like the choking of a creature trying to claw free from inside its own skin, the kind of sound that chilled even the most blood-hardened beast. It echoed through the twisted trees like a curse, awakening those who dared sleep. Ghorvak opened his eye. The camp was still, or what passed for stillness, in Athel Loren. The canopy overhead shifted with a breath that didn't belong to wind. The leaves whispered in a tongue only the forest understood. Fires sputtered low, casting jagged shadows over furred backs and breasting blades. But something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. He rose, slow and deliberate. The earth was damp, always damp, but tonight it pulsed. Beneath his hooves, it beat like a second heart. Wrong, hungry, alert. His warriors stirred, restless, sensing it too. A few paced like caged beasts. One curled in the dirt, chewing his own fingers to the bone with a vacant stare. Another scream. This one closer. They found the source near the edge of camp. Cragnash, a hulking bestigor, lay on the ground convulsing, his back arched violently, bones snapping under his own muscle spasms. Foam bubbled from his mouth, tinted red with blood. His eyes had turned black, all white swallowed by something unnatural. His hands, clawed and thick, tore at his face, pulling strips of flesh from his cheeks, as if trying to peel away the man beneath the beast. Morgruk stood nearby, staff pressed into the earth, muttering in broken chants. "It's taken root," he hissed. "The forest is inside him now, testing us." Ghorvak snarled, "Test this." He strode forward and grabbed Cragnash by the throat, lifting the spasming creature like a rag doll. His muscles rippled with barely contained rage. Cragnash flailed, but Ghorvak tightened his grip until the struggling stilled. Foam hissed through the cracks in the dying beast's teeth. Then the change came. With a cracking pop, Cragnash's skull split. Not broken, opened, like bark parting on a cursed tree. From the rupture a branch grew, black and wet with rot, shooting skyward from his skull like a crown. Vines burst from his chest, snaking around Ghorvak's arm, trying to pull him into the transformation. Cragnash's body swelled, bloated with unnatural growth, bones warping, muscles bulging with thorny tumors. "Let him become the grove's herald," Morgruk cried, entranced. "Let him speak its will." Ghorvak's snarl became a roar. With a single monstrous swing, he brought his axe down on Cragnash's neck. The body spasmed, twitched, then collapsed in two grotesque halves. The vines shrieked like dying children as they curled and blackened in the air. A stench of rot and sap erupted, sickly sweet and cloying. Ghorvak stood over the corpse, chest heaving. "No voice but mine," he growled. The herd watched in silence, the firelight reflecting off blood-slick blades and wide, trembling eyes. The message was clear. The forest could try to claim them, but it would pay for every inch of flesh in ruin and ruin again. Still, unease crept like mist. Others had begun to twitch, scratch, whisper. The infection wasn't one of flesh. It was will. The trees did not kill. They invaded. They wore down sanity like water on stone until beast became nothing but roots and bark and memory. Morgruk approached Ghorvak, head lowered. His voice was hoarse. "The grove is inside them. Inside all of us. You stoke it with every step. Every drop of blood spilled here feeds the warden. It grows strong. It grows ready." Ghorvak stared down at him, nostrils flaring. "Then let it grow. Let it ready itself. I'll cut it down at the roots and drink from its heart." He turned to the herd. "Rest is over. We march. No more sleep, no more dreams. Not here. Only war." The Gorima herd moved. As one. Into deeper shadow, into thicker madness. And behind them, Cragnash's corpse shuddered once more. A single green shoot sprouted from the meat of his spine, pulsing in rhythm with the forest's hidden heart. Chapter 6. The Living Forest. The forest did not wait this time. It struck first. The Gormal herd had been marching barely an hour past dawn when the first tree moved. Not the creak of boughs in the wind, not the groan of old wood settling. This was motion, intentional, deliberate, a towering trunk twisted with impossible speed, sweeping a pair of Ghors into the air and smashing them against a boulder. Their bones cracked like twigs beneath the blow, bodies reduced to ruin in an instant. Panic erupted. Ghorvak didn't blink. He saw it clearly now. The forest wasn't just alive. It was a warrior. Every root, every branch, every leaf an extension of an ancient will forged in hatred. The very earth had turned against them. "Form the crescent," he bellowed. "Hold!" The warriors obeyed, blood-mad instinct overcoming fear. Shields raised, weapons drawn, they formed into a jagged line, snarling, sweating, ready to die. But the enemy was everywhere. Trees walked. Massive shapes of bark and sap shambled from the gloom, living sentinels of Athel Loren. They were not Treeman like Vrrangal. These were lesser but no less deadly. Bark-armored limbs swung like siege hammers, smashing skulls, ripping apart Ghors like rag dolls. One Beastlord tried to charge, roaring, his twin axes flashing, only for a root to lance up from the ground and spear him through the groin, lifting him screaming into the air. The forest laughed. It wasn't a sound, more a feeling, a pressure behind the eyes, a rustle in the ears that carried glee. Every scream was a note in its twisted song. Morgrik raised his staff and howled, black lightning crackling from his fingertips. The spell struck a tree creature in the chest, searing bark, splitting it open in a blossom of flame and filth. The thing writhed, burned, then exploded, showering the warriors in smoldering splinters and acidic sap. But for each that fell, another came. Ghorvak waded into the melee like a beast king reborn. His axe sang through the air, carving into living wood with every strike. Bark split, branches shattered. One creature lunged at him with limbs like clubs. He ducked beneath the swing, rammed his horns into its core and tore a chunk from its body with his teeth. "Faint," he roared, froth flying from his jaws. "Even gods bleed." Around him, his herd fought like demons. A minotaur charged through 3 tree creatures, his horns stained green-black. A Ghor was torn in half, top and bottom, his entrails slapping wetly onto the roots. Another shrieked as a branch drove through his eye, skewering his skull like a trophy. Then came the second wave. From the canopy above, smaller creatures dropped, twisted dryads and bark-born horrors, with razor-thin limbs and hollow, whispering mouths. They swarmed the rear ranks, slicing tendons, peeling back skin with fingernails like thorns. One leapt onto Morgrik, hissing a curse in an alien tongue. He responded by biting into its face, tearing away half its head. But it was chaos now. The formation buckled. The crescent became a knot of bodies, limbs flailing, blood spraying. Ghorvak was everywhere, an avatar of fury, his axe dripping, his roar constant. He felled a dozen foes, then a dozen more. His arm bled, his side throbbed, but he stood. He would always stand. At last, the tide began to falter. The spells of the Bray shaman burned new paths. The minotaurs rallied, goring through the flanks. Ghors formed smaller packs, hacking down the barkborn in frenzied vengeance. The forest recoiled. Slowly, reluctantly it withdrew. Not defeated, nearly sated. The glade fell silent, save for the wet, ragged breath of survivors and the creak of shifting branches overhead. Corpses littered the ground. 50 dead, maybe more. Some were no longer recognizable. Bones jutted from places they didn't belong. Eyes stared from hollowed skulls. Guts painted roots like garlands. The blood soaked into the forest floor, and the trees drank. Ghorvak stood at the center, soaked in gore, his axe quivering in his grip. He spat onto the earth. "You want war," he growled to the forest, to the trees, to the gods. "You've got it." He raised his axe high, and the survivors roared with him, an anthem of pain, fury, and defiance. And from far away, so deep in the forest it seemed a world away, something ancient smiled. Chapter 7. Herd Fracture. The dead hung from the trees. Their bodies were trophies, warnings, and offerings all at once. Bound by entrails, looped through sockets and jaws, the corpses of fallen gores and barkborn alike twisted slowly in the breeze. The forest had grown quiet again, but not with peace. It was the silence of a coiled snake, of breath held before the strike. The Ghormal herd moved cautiously now. Their numbers had thinned like winter fur. Their howls no longer echoed with unshakable dominance, but with suspicion, weariness. The air between them carried more than the stench of blood. It carried something fouler. Doubt. It festered behind their eyes, coiling like a worm through the cracks of their rage. The trees loomed closer, closer every hour. Gnarled limbs curled overhead, blotting out even the suggestion of sun. Some trees bled. Others wept sap that smelled like tears. Strange shapes moved in the periphery, never fully seen, only felt. Shadows that watched, that judged. It was too much for some, and on the seventh night the fracture came. The herd had stopped to rest in a hollow choked with fungal mist. Fires crackled weakly, refusing to grow. Meat roasted over black coals, its origin unspoken. Morgruk muttered incantations into the dark, weaving sigils with bone ash and blood. Ghorvak stood nearby, sharpening his axe with a whetstone stained from skulls long past. That's when Hrothar stepped forward. A bestigor nearly Ghorvak's equal in size and brutality, Hrothar's horns curled in proud spirals. His chest bore the scars of 50 battles. His breath reeked of mead and hate. "This path leads to rot," he snarled, his voice thick with contempt. "We lose brothers to trees and shadows, not blades. We follow madness, not war." The herd stilled. Dozens of eyes turned. The silence crackled with potential bloodshed. Ghorvak did not move, did not blink. Hrothar took another step. "You fight ghosts, not foes. You scream into trees. What god rewards this? What warband thrives in whispers and vines? No glory here, no spoils, only death." A few gores murmured. The seeds of betrayal watered with fear. Ghorvak lowered his axe. He walked slowly, methodically, until he stood toe-to-toe with Hrothar. They were beasts of equal might, but different hearts. Hrothar's pounded with fear, disguised as strength. Ghorvak's burned with something deeper. He raised one clawed finger, pressing it against Hrothar's chest. "Turn back," he said softly, "but do it as meat." Then the axe rose, too fast to follow. It came down on Hrothar's collarbone, biting deep. Hrothar roared, swung back with his own blade, but Ghorvak caught his wrist mid-swing and twisted. Bones snapped. Flesh tore. The axe came again, once, twice, thrice. The third blow sheared through Hrothar's neck, leaving the head clinging by sinew and muscle. With a snarl, Ghorvak ripped it free and held it aloft. "This," he bellowed, turning in a slow circle, "is what doubt earns." He hurled the head into the fire. The flames hissed. The flesh sizzled. The herd fell to its knees. No more words. No more murmurs. The challengers had seen their fate, and the survivors would remember the price of hesitation. But not all were cowed. Later that night, while the camp dozed in uneasy slumber, 5 gorse slipped away. Cowards. Traitors. They didn't howl. They didn't scream. They vanished like mist into the trees, into the dark. By morning, Their corpses were returned, nailed to trees upside down, entrails knotted into runes, eyes removed and replaced with glowing amber stones. The forest had cast its judgment, and so had Ghorvak. Chapter 8. Ashen Grove. The smell of fire lingered like a curse. It clung to the trees, thick and bitter, clawing at the throat like a burning brand. Smoke wove between branches in tight, slithering coils, trailing the Gormau herd as they stumbled into the dead grove, where the forest had already lost a war it dared not speak of. Here, Athel Loren was silent, not out of patience, but out of grief. The grove had been burned once before, long ago, by hands even more foolish than Ghorvak's. Blackened trunks jutted skyward like broken spears, charred and split, their insides hollowed out into shrines of soot. The earth beneath the herd's hooves was ash and bone, thick as snow, crunching with every step. There were no birds here, no insects, not even wind, only the smell of old fire and the promise of new wrath. Ghorvak halted at the center of the grove. A wide clearing opened around him, ringed by scorched trees warped into grotesque shapes by unnatural heat. Some looked like they had twisted mid-scream, others still smoldered. The ground was split by an ancient scar, a burn mark so deep it carved into the bedrock like a wound that never healed. Morgruk approached slowly, dragging his staff through the ash. His eyes glimmered with unease. "This was once a shrine," he murmured, "to a spirit older than the warden. One they burned, thinking it would not rise again." Ghorvak sniffed the air. His face twisted into something that might have been a smile if such things had a place on a beast like him. "Let's burn it again." He raised his axe and pointed it toward a twisted idol, an old half-melted effigy of wood and stone, scorched and cracked, but still standing defiantly amid the ruin. "This is where the warden watched, where it mourned." Morgruk warned, his voice thick with dark knowing. "To desecrate this ground will awaken more than vengeance. It will stir memory." "Good," Ghorvak growled. "I want it to remember me." With a roar, he charged. The first blow shattered the effigy's arm, the second cleaved it at the waist, and the third he raised high, bellowing to the uncaring sky, fell with such force that the statue split down the middle, crumbling into ash and splinters. Then the forest screamed. Not the grove, the forest. The ground shook. The trees beyond the clearing wailed, not from wind but from within. Roots writhed in agony. Branches snapped. From the split earth, geysers of dark sap erupted, spraying upward like vomit from the bowels of the land itself. The ashes came alive. Figures rose. Not dryads, not barkborn. These were the ghosts of fire, the charred, the burnt, the undead remnants of those who once worshipped in this grove. Wraith-like things, cloaked in cinders, eyes aglow with ember light, their mouths opened, and from them came no words, only the sound of burning flesh. They struck without warning. One hurled itself at a Ghor, embedding flaming claws into his face. The flesh didn't burn, it disintegrated, flaking away like paper in a furnace. Another wrapped around a minotaur's leg, pulling it down, dragging it screaming into the scorched soil, as if the ground had opened to swallow it whole. Ghorvak swung wildly, his axe catching one of the flame wraiths. It burst apart with a sound like cracking bone, but the embers rained down, scalding the herd. Morgruk screamed incantations, black smoke pouring from his mouth. He summoned walls of shadow to hold the dead at bay, but even the dark shuddered in this place. And then the center of the grove split. The roots parted like lips, and from the gash emerged something old. It was not large, but it felt vast. A being wrapped in bark so black it seemed to devour light, its face a tangle of broken wood and weeping knots. No eyes, no mouth, just a void. The Ashen Herald, the final guardian of this sacred wound. It moved without sound, gliding over the ash. Where it passed, fire followed. A Ghor charged it and froze mid-stride, his body consumed by flame from within, bursting apart in a halo of heat and ash. Ghorvak didn't hesitate. He roared, lunged, swung, and was caught. The herald's tendrils wrapped around his axe arm, squeezing, tightening. Wood and shadow fused around his limb. Pain lanced up his spine, hot and bright. Ghorvak snarled, twisted, bit into the tendrils, and tore free, leaving strips of his own flesh behind. Then he plunged his axe into the creature's chest. No scream, but it shook. It shuddered, and then collapsed in on itself, crumbling into cinders. The grove fell quiet. The fire wraiths vanished, sucked back into the ash. The ground stilled. The trees beyond held their breath. Ghorvak stood panting, arm mangled, blood running freely. But the idol was gone. The guardian destroyed, the memory defiled. He turned, half grinning, half bleeding. I told it to remember. And from the trees, so deep, so far, came the sound of groaning roots. The warden had heard. Chapter 9. The Whispering Oak. The path narrowed until it was no path at all, only a jagged vein through the heart of Athel Loren, pulsing with tension, wrapped in silence so thick it suffocated. The trees pressed inward. Their branches hung heavy, low enough to graze the backs of the Ghoremore herd, as if feeling for weakness. Their bark was carved with ancient runes, worn smooth by time and blood, glowing faintly with an amber sickliness. Something had changed. The air was colder here, not the chill of night, but of something forgotten, something buried. Even Ghorvak's breath fogged, and for the first time since the beginning of the hunt, his step faltered. Just once. Enough for the others to notice. They reached the oak at dusk. It was older than memory. A colossal giant, split through the middle yet standing strong, its interior hollowed and blackened, as if something had once burned at its core and been denied death. Its roots spread like claws, coiling around the stones and bones of the glade. The canopy stretched so high it vanished into darkness, crowned in leaves the color of blood clots and bruises. The Whispering Oak. Mulgruk's voice broke the silence, soft and afraid. This is where they say the warden first opened its eyes, where it drank the sorrow of the forest. It remembers every scream, every flame, every horn that dared tread here. The herd gathered around the tree warily. No bird sang, no insects hummed. The wind itself dared not blow. Then the oak whispered. At first it was breath, barely audible, but it grew, whispers overlapping, rising into a susurrus like 1,000 dead voices arguing with leaves. They weren't words. They were reminders, echoes of the Ghoremore herd's sins. Their doubts, their kills. One Ghor dropped to his knees, claws clamped over his ears, shrieking. Another stared up into the branches, whimpering as blood streamed from his eyes. The oak spoke to each beast alone. To one, it was the sobbing of a mother flayed alive. To another, the shriek of prey begging for mercy they never gave. To Ghorvak, it was laughter. The same laugh that rang through his skull when Vrrangal had cast him aside like nothing. That deep, low rumble, not cruel, but disappointed. As if Ghorvak's rage had never mattered. As if his warband, his pride, his existence had been beneath notice. His lip curled. "You want me to break?" he snarled into the oak. "You want me to kneel?" He stepped forward, placing a palm against the bark. It was warm, and it beat like a heart. Suddenly, the tree split open, not with wood cracking, but flesh tearing. A gaping wound yawned wide in the trunk, revealing a corridor of pulsing root and crimson sap. The tree was letting him in. Morgruk hissed. "This is no passage. It's judgment." "I do not care," Ghorvak growled. "I will tear truth from its gut." He stepped inside. The tunnel swallowed him whole. It was dark, wet. The walls throbbed with slow, syrupy movement. Root flesh slithered across his shoulders as he moved, gripping him gently, then possessively. Faces formed in the bark, faces of those he'd slain, grinning, weeping, screaming. All of them spoke in unison. "You are rage without purpose, bone without marrow, horn without pride." He pressed forward, snarling, until he reached the heart. Full chamber, round, vaulted in root and bark, lit by a pale greenish glow pulsing from a knot in the center, a seed the size of a skull, floating, humming, alive. Around it, tendrils coiled like intestines, feeding, pulsing, whispering. It was the oak's memory, its soul. And it saw him. Visions exploded in his mind, Vrrangal towering in the mists, Goramor herd dying by the dozens, Ghorvak crushed beneath a root the size of a tree trunk, one horn torn free, his eyes darkening as life fled. He screamed, but not in fear, feeling defiance. He hurled his axe at the seed. It struck. The knot exploded in a spray of glowing ichor, lighting the chamber like a sunburst. The walls screamed, the tunnel writhed, roots flailed like panicked serpents, but Ghorvak stood in the middle of the storm, chest heaving, arms bloodied, teeth bared in triumph. Outside, the oak howled. Branches snapped. The sky darkened. The forest shook. The Gorimar herd fell to their knees. Ghorvak emerged from the haughty soaked in sap, eyes blazing. "It knows me now," he rasped. "It fears me now." And far off, in the deepest hollow of Athel Loren, the Verdant warden stirred. Chapter 10. Tangle of the Dead. The rain came like a curse. It did not fall. It descended in sheets of thick, oily water that painted the world in muted grays and washed blood into the cracks of the earth. It stung the skin, leaving welts, stripping war paint from the Gorimar herd's hides like peeling bark. It drowned their scent in the mud and drenched their breath in cold. But Ghorvak marched through it as if it were nothing. They came to the clearing just before dusk. There the rain stopped, not because the clouds relented, but because the forest would not allow it. The canopy was too dense, too unnatural. Every leaf caught the downpour and funneled it down into black roots that throbbed just beneath the soil. No bird sang here, no creature stirred. The air was still, thick with rot and something worse. This was a grave. They knew it before they stepped inside. Dozens of stone cairns jutted from the earth like broken teeth, each marked with crude runes, piled bones, or shattered weapons, remnants of past herds. Beastmen from another age, long dead, their corpses offered to the forest in penance. The ground was littered with fragments of totems, horns, and skulls, gnawed by time and vines alike. The forest had not forgotten these fallen. It had devoured them. Morgruk fell to one knee, breath hitching. His staff rattled in his grip, teeth clenching with pain as whispers poured from the stones. "They were like us," he muttered, foam flecking his lips. "Hunters, warlords, fools. They came here seeking to wound the warden. They bled and became roots, flesh-fed bark. Pride became mulch, A low growl rolled from Ghorvak's throat. He stepped into the clearing. Each cairn pulsed faintly as he passed, stones sweating ichor, bones twitching. He reached the largest cairn at the center, a monument twice his height, crowned with a skull larger than any minotaur, cracked down the center like a split melon. The runes etched on the base glowed green. Faint, hungry, he raised his axe and struck. The blow echoed like thunder. The cairn split, spilling its contents, bones blackened by time, runes etched into femurs, tusks tangled in roots like shackles. And then a sound, not a whisper, a breath. Something exhaled from the stones, from the dirt, from the dead. The ground erupted. Skeletal limbs burst upward, dragging crumbling torsos into the light. These were not true undead, not reanimated by necromancers or dark gods. These were fossils of hate, stirred from their slumber by rage alone. Their bones fused with roots and vines, their horns cracked but proud, their mouths stretched in eternal war cries. The pest had come to feed. The Goromor herd screamed, steel meeting bone, claws raking against rusted axes. The clearing exploded in chaos. Skeletal bestigers leapt like wolves, clawing at the living with rust-stained bone fingers. A minotaur skeleton, taller than any current brute, slammed into one of Ghorvak's champions, shattering him underfoot like a child's toy. Ghorvak roared, charging through the melee. He cleaved through two revenants in a single swing, their bones exploding in a burst of splinters and vine marrow. Another lunged from behind. He caught its skull with one hand and crushed it like rotted fruit. Bone dust filled the air, mixed with the stink of old sap and burned flesh. Morgruk weaved his dark magics, calling forth tendrils of shadow to crush the risen dead. Each spell he cast sapped his strength. His face drained to waxy gray, eyes sunken with the weight of what he saw. These were kings, he muttered, staggering. These were lords. A hand clawed from the dirt, thicker, older, darker. The corpse that rose from it was a monster, 8 feet tall, bound in ancient bronze plates fused with tree bark, a skull helm grown into its head. Its axe was not iron, it was stone, carved from petrified heartwood, humming with age. Its eye sockets burned with green flame. It was the first Beastlord who had dared the Warden, the one who died so deep even the gods had forgotten his name. It turned to Ghorvak and charged. Their weapons clashed with a sound like mountains splitting. Ghorvak reeled, teeth bared, strength challenged like never before. The ancient swung again and again, every blow a hurricane. One hit sent Ghorvak skidding through the mud, blood flying from his shoulder. But he did not fall. He roared, charged, met the old king once more in a clash of fury and fire. Axe struck stone blade, bone met flesh. Ghorvak found his opening, plunged his axe up through the jawbone out the top of the skull. The ancient staggered, paused, then collapsed, a whisper of dust on the wind. The others faltered. One by one, the dead fell. Bones crumbled. Roots retracted. The ground groaned in mourning and then fell silent once more. Ghorvak stood at the center, drenched in black ichor and gore, breathing in ragged gasps. He looked around, gaze sweeping over shattered cairns and lifeless corpses. "We are not them," he said, low, final, veiled, "and we endure." And the forest listened. Chapter 11. Horns of the Wild. The horns called out at dawn. Not the crude braying blasts of gores in battle frenzy. These were old horns, deep and booming, carved from ancient beast skulls and bound in chains of bone. Their call rolled through Athel Loren like the growl of a slumbering god, long, low, and filled with promise of blood. The Gorima herd halted mid-march. Ghorvak raised his head. His eye narrowed. He knew that sound, not from memory but from instinct. It was a challenge, not from the forest, not from spirits, from another herd, from rivals. The trees parted like a curtain, not gently, but ripped open, as if something massive had torn through them. From the gash emerged warriors, dozens, hundreds. Fur streaked with ochre and blood, their weapons jagged with iron and obsidian. Their bodies were scarred, not just from battle, but from ritual. They moved with the arrogance of victors. At their center strode a colossus, Beastlord Rakkar Cragtusk, a legend among the herds of the southern Drakvald. He wore a cloak of stitched scalps, his horns coiled twice around his head like a ram's crown. His arms were thick as tree trunks, his axe a slab of black iron chained to his forearm, dripped with dried gore and sigils burned into the blade. He grinned at Ghorvak. "A trail of blood too wide to ignore," he growled. "You burn a forest and expect no one to follow?" Ghorvak stepped forward. His own herd shifted uneasily behind him, not with fear, but with anticipation. "You come to join?" Ghorvak asked, voice like gravel being ground under hooves. "How to lead," Cragtusk spat. "You lost to the warden once. You limp into its jaws. I bring strength. I bring the teeth. Then you bring bones to be broken." The challenge was accepted before either spoke again. They charged, not with ceremony, not with warning. Two beastlords, titans among monsters, colliding in a blur of muscle, horn, and iron. Cragtusk swung first, his axe a battering ram. Ghorvak dodged low, then surged up, horns catching Cragtusk in the gut, lifting him off the ground before slamming him into the dirt. The impact cracked the stone beneath them. Cragtusk rolled, came up snarling, his blade carving a red line across Ghorvak's thigh. They circled. The herds formed a ring around them, frothing, snarling, weapons clashing against shields in a storm of anticipation. Cragtusk lunged again, this time catching Ghorvak's axe mid-swing. He drove a fist into Ghorvak's jaw, snapping teeth loose, then another blow to the ribs. Bones cracked, blood sprayed. Ghorvak laughed. He bit down on Cragtusk's arm, tearing flesh away in a spray of steaming red. Then he brought his knee into Cragtusk's snout, shattering it with a wet crunch. The rival staggered back. Ghorvak was already moving, swinging low. The axe struck home. It bit deep into Cragtusk's thigh, through muscle and bone. Cragtusk roared, collapsed to one knee. Ghorvak didn't hesitate. He dropped his axe, grabbed the beast by the horns, and twisted. There was a snap, a gurgle, and then silence. Ghorvak stood over the corpse of Cragtusk, panting, bloodied, victorious. He raised the broken horn of his rival and roared, "Hear me. All who follow now answer to Ghorvak One-Horn. We do not crawl into this forest. We hunt it." The Cragtusk herd howled their surrender. Weapons clashed to earth, knees bent. The Gorima and Cragtusk herds became one, swelling with fresh blood, fresh madness, fresh power. Wagrif stepped beside his master, eyes gleaming with awe. "You're no longer a beast chasing vengeance," he murmured. "You're becoming a god of it." Ghorvak did not answer. He turned to the forest, lips peeled back in a grin. Now the hunt would truly begin. Chapter 12. Roots of Despair. The deeper they marched, the louder the forest breathed. It was not the wind, it was not the creak of trees or the murmur of leaves. It was something lower, more primal, the inhaling and exhaling of a living god. A thrum in the marrow, a pressure behind the eyes. It came with every step now. The Ghorma herd, bolstered by Cragtusk's kin, pushed forward through a land no longer pretending to be natural. The soil was soft. Each step sank slightly deeper than it should. Roots pulsed beneath the surface, like veins just under skin. Some moved, some twitched. The forest was not watching anymore. It was feeling them. They crossed a threshold of moss-covered stones, marked with runes not of chaos but of sorrow. The trees here leaned inward, not by growth, but as if listening. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Only the breath, in, out. A slow, cruel rhythm. Then the dreams began, at first in sleep, then in waking. Gors wandered from the warband, eyes blank, mouths muttering names no one recognized. Some stopped mid-step and began to sob like calves. One Minotaur had to be restrained when he began to chew his own fingers, convinced they were worms burrowing beneath his skin. The whispers followed. Ghorvak heard them too, not in words, in memories, twisted versions of his own. His first kill, a rival choked on his own entrails, now recalled as a mewling creature begging for mercy. The night he shattered his father's skull under the full moon, now seen as cowardice. The warden mocked him. Morgruk walked beside him, eyes sunken, bleeding black from his nostrils. "The forest no longer fights with roots," he rasped. "It fights with truths. It fights with lies," Ghorvak growled. "You doing which is which anymore?" They came upon a clearing drenched in still water. Not a lake, too shallow. More a mirror stretched across the forest floor. Perfect. Utterly still. Its surface did not ripple, though the air above it boiled faintly. In its reflection, the herd did not see themselves. They saw their deaths. One by one they looked. One by one they saw. Agor slashed his own throat moments later, laughing through the blood. Another fell to his knees and began screaming, "I am already ash! I am already ash!" until his throat shredded and he fell forward into the black water. A Bestiga tried to blind himself with a dagger, but his brothers held him back. Ghorvak stepped to the edge. He saw the moment, the final moment. Him, alone. His herd dead, his horn shattered, his axe lost. Vrrangal looming above him like a god carved from vengeance, roots wrapping his body, pulling him into the earth like a seed returning home. Buried, forgotten. He stared into the water for a long time. Then he spat. "Even if it comes," he said, voice sharp, "it will remember me." He raised his axe and smashed the surface. The reflection vanished in a storm of ripples. The water hissed and boiled, steam erupted, choking the air. Trees groaned in outrage. The earth shook. And from the edge of the clearing, roots came. Not vines, not tendrils. Roots, thick, wet, black, as wide as a Ghur's chest. They surged from the ground like serpents, wrapping around the herd, flinging beasts like rag dolls. One Ghur was impaled through the groin, lifted screaming, then split down the middle with a sickening wet rip. A Minotaur was dragged into the earth, screaming until his lungs filled with mud. Morgruk shouted curses, flinging fire and darkness into the soil. Roots shriveled. Ghorvak hacked one apart mid-leap, his axe cleaving bark and sinew in equal measure. He rolled through the mud, rose, and roared. No visions, no lies. No future but war. Come then. The forest trembled at his defiance. The roots receded, but the damage was done. Another dozen dead, dozens more shaken. Morgruk collapsed to his knees, wheezing. The herd was fraying, cracked. The roots hadn't just attacked the body, they'd burrowed into the will. Ghorvak stood among the carnage, chest rising and falling. He looked to the trees, to the looming canopy, to the thick shadows beyond. "I see you," he snarled. "Others in the group." "I see you." And in the heart of the forest, Vrrangal awoke fully. Chapter 13. The Thorn Trial. The grove looked wrong. Even for Athel Loren, whose every inch twisted with spite and memory, this place was too symmetrical. Trees arranged in a perfect circle, equidistant, bark smoothed like flesh scarred over with precision. The air tasted of iron, the wind had teeth. No birds, no beasts, only silence, coiled tight like a trap waiting to spring. In the center of the circle stood a throne of thorns. Not a carved seat, not a crafted relic. It had grown that way, spiked and spiraled, alive with pulsing vines that dripped with a thick red sap. The roots beneath it glowed with a dull amber hunger, their throb matching the pulse in Ghorvak's neck. He stepped forward, alone. Behind him, the herd waited at the grove's edge. They dared not enter. Even Crag-Tusk's strongest kin flinched as their hooves touched the boundary. Some wept, some dropped to their knees in trance. The thorn trial was for the leader, the wound-bearer, the one marked for judgment. Mulgruk muttered behind him, blood running from his ears. "It's older than the Walton," he choked. "It's the forest's tribunal. It chooses who walks deeper." Ghorvak didn't pause. He entered the circle. The moment his hoof crossed the line, the grove breathed, the air sucked inward, the trees sighed, and the throne awakened. It split open like a mouth. Not metaphorically, a true wet mouth ringed in spines and tendrils, a gullet of thorn bark slick with sap and steaming rot. A voice issued forth, not spoken but grown. 1,000 voices, layered. Male, female, child, beast, bled, broken, born again, it whispered. "But are you worthy?" The grove twisted. Suddenly Ghorvak wasn't in the circle. He was in a memory, but wrong, warped. He stood on the battlefield where he first became Beastlord, facing his old chieftain. But the fight was wrong, too fast, too cruel. His younger self was beaten, humiliated. The herd laughed. The chieftain spared him. "You would have died if not for mercy," the voices hissed. "Your strength began in pity." The scene shifted. He saw the Ghormar herd, saw them burn villages, tear apart wood elves, butcher spirits. But in the vision they were driven back. Gors weeping, minotaurs begging for death, and Ghorvak kneeling, offering his horn to the warden in submission. "You would submit to survive," the voices chanted. "Your rage is pretense, your vengeance a mask." "No," Ghorvak growled. The thorned throne hissed. Another scene, one deeper. His mother, her skull crushed beneath hooves. Not his father's, not the story he had always believed. His own. He had done it. As a child, lost in frenzy. "You have always lied to yourself," the grove whispered. "We offer truth." He was surrounded now, ghosts of his own making. Those he had killed. The cowardly, the innocent, the loyal. They reached for him, touched him, clawed into his skin with hands made of memory. And then, one hand gripped his chest. It burned. A thorn pierced his heart. Real pain. The test had become flesh. He dropped to his knees, roaring, claws digging into the dirt, blood pouring from his eyes, ears, mouth. The thorn twisted inside him, pressing into his soul. Then he grabbed it. pulled it free. With a cry like a dying god, Ghorvak ripped the thorn from his own heart. His chest burst open in a spray of gore, bone exposed, flesh shredded. But he stood. He stood heart open, bleeding into the grove. "I am not here for your approval," he snarled. "I am not here to be chosen." "I am the fire you buried," he roared, holding the thorn aloft, dripping. "I'm Ghorvak One-Horn, and I take what I desire." The grove screamed. The throne cracked, split down the middle, and bloomed. Petals of bone and bark unfolded, revealing a seed at its heart, jet black, veined with gold. Ghorvak seized it. The voices fell silent. Its trees bowed, and Ghorvak left the circle, bleeding, broken, victorious. He did not look back. He didn't need to. The thorn trial had judged him, and lost. Chapter 14. Glade of Ghosts. The mist thickened as the Ghormal herd approached the glade. It rolled low and heavy, pale and writhing like the breath of the dead. It clung to their hides, seeped into nostrils and lungs, made eyes water and skin crawl. It muffled sound. Blades clinked dull against armor, hooves pressed into silence. Even the roars of minotaurs became whispers here. Something waited in that mist. The glade emerged like a wound, soft earth surrounded by skeletal trees, their limbs stripped bare, bark scorched, bleeding a black sap that hissed where it hit the ground. At the center, a pond of absolute stillness, dark as pitch, unmoving, as if time itself had drowned in its depths. Morgruk fell to his knees. The Bray shaman clutched his head, eyes rolled back, foam and blood frothing from his mouth. His voice came in guttural bursts, words not his own. "We enter the hollow of memory. This is where the dead scream forever." Ghorvak strode ahead, the black seed from the thorn trial still pulsing in his fist like a newborn heart. He didn't hesitate. He never did. But behind him, warriors trembled. Some whispered prayers to gods long silent. Some turned their heads toward the trees, as if hearing voices. If they were, the glade responded to presence. The fog deepened, and shapes stepped from it. Not illusions, not spirits. These were ghosts in form, yes, but wrapped in flesh. Semi-ambient bodies of those once living, their mouths slack, their eyes milky height and bottomless. Each one was known. Every beast in the herd saw someone different. One Ghor screamed and dropped his weapon, backing away from the specter of his brother, long devoured by carrion beasts. The Bestiger fell to his knees before the shade of his former chieftain, begging for forgiveness, before the ghost reached down and tore his jaw from his face with both hands. Ghorvak saw them too. They came not in ones, but in legions. All the dead he had left behind, his herd from the first hunt, his rivals, the children he'd crushed underfoot in burned villages, a Bray shaman who once called him brother. Even Grothar, his body still fresh in the memory, throat torn and horns snapped. They stood in a ring around him, silently accusing. And then they charged. The glade erupted in war. Ghost flesh met living muscle. The undead tore with claws of frost and rage. Beasts howled in agony, raked open by their own pasts. A minotaur was dragged screaming into the pond, its surface closing like glass behind him. Ghors were impaled by translucent spears, their screams vanishing into the fog. Ghorvak fought, but here his axe passed through nothing. The ghosts were not made of flesh, but regret, memory. His axe swung and met mist, but their claws sank deep. He roared, blood spraying from a dozen wounds, and turned to Morgruk. The shaman was convulsing, floating above the earth, eyes boiling black, The mist poured into him, through him. He became the glade's mouth. Through cracked lips, hundreds of voices spoke at once. You are made of ruin, Ghorvak One-Horn. You wear pride like armor, but bleed guilt. You call yourself predator, but all you've made is ashes. You are not feared. You are pitied. Ghorvak dropped to one knee. His body trembled, but not with pain, with laughter, deep, bitter, real. He rose to his feet, threw down his axe, and screamed. I know what I am. He beat his chest with bloodied fists. I am not your shame. I am your consequence. He stepped forward and grabbed Morgrek's throat. The shaman shrieked, the ghosts wailed, the fog recoiled. Ghorvak lifted Morgrek into the air. Use my voice, Forest, he hissed, and I will feed you screams. He drove a horn into Morgrek's chest, piercing the ribcage, cracking bone, sending a gout of black energy erupting from the wound. The connection shattered. The fog fled. The ghosts screamed and burned in the light of Ghorvak's rage, vanishing like smoke caught in a storm. Morgrek collapsed, twitching, eyes blank, alive, but emptied. The pond stilled once more. The glade went silent. Ghorvak retrieved his axe. Behind him, the herd rose, wounded, weeping, changed. The past had tried to break them. It had failed. Ahead, deeper into the forest, the roots shook. Vrrangal had heard. Chapter 15. Green Fire. The sky burned green. Not with sunlight. Not with magic. This was something older, more malevolent. A spectral blaze bled from the treetops, crawling like sickness across the canopy. It did not flicker. It seeped, illuminating the world beneath it with a glow that warped shadow and color alike. The leaves above twisted in its light, curling inward, as though trying to hide from what they'd birthed. The Ghorimaw herd moved slowly now, reduced to grim silence. The glade of ghosts had left its mark, scars on the flesh and deeper wounds beneath. Gors glanced over their shoulders too often. Bestigors gripped their axes too tightly. Even the minotaurs had ceased their growling, eyes hollowed, nostrils flared with dread. Only Ghorvak pressed forward without pause. His steps were heavier, his wounds unhealed, his fur matted with weeks of rot and blood. But his gaze had never been more focused. A fire of defiance burned within his chest, one not conjured by gods or glory. It was personal now. They came upon the ruins just past dusk, twisted stone archways, half consumed by bark and vine, statues of long-forgotten elven gods, defaced by time and claw. At the center, a structure, circular, open to the sky, its columns blackened and melted. The floor was a mosaic of green glass, cracked by age and scorched by history. Morgrek limped beside Ghorvak, his robes half torn, his staff dragging behind him. This was a temple, he rasped, eyes trembling. A druidic seat. The place where spirits were bound. Ghorvak stepped into the circle. The ground hissed. Green fire burst from the stone, a ring of spectral flame that danced without heat. It formed runes in the air, symbols of warning, of sealing, of sacrifice. The flames coiled upward, writhing around the ruins like serpents made of smoke and soul. From beneath the temple floor, the voices rose. Not whispers, not words. Wails. The kind that make flesh crawl and bones ache. The sound of things left behind. Spirits, once guardians, now broken. They did not speak, they screamed. In grief, in rage, in unforgiving remembrance. The green fire exploded. A wave of it surged through the air, slamming into the herd like a tidal flood. Gores were thrown backward, fur scorched, eyes burned from their sockets. One Bestigor burst into flame from the inside, glowing green as he howled, clawing at his belly until his own entrails spilled in fire. Ghorvak stood in the storm, axe raised. Shadow formed in the center of the circle, tall, spindled, shifting. A spirit beast, built from fire and hate. Its body was tree and smoke and anguish, with a skull face weeping molten light. It moved like flame, graceful, unbound, consuming. It was the warden's wrath. The last line before him. It struck with a screech. A tendril of green light whipped forward, lashing a minotaur across the chest, splitting him open mid-bellow. Ribs visible before his body ignited. Another tendril slammed into a gore's skull, melting it like wax, the creature stumbling headless before collapsing. Ghorvak roared and met it head-on. His axe passed through its form, but the fire recoiled, twisted in pain, not of flesh, but of defiance. It lunged again, and Ghorvak caught it with his arm, letting it burn through sinew and bone as he drove his blade deep into the heart of its flame. They collided in a storm of green and red. Fire screamed, steel sang, blood boiled. Ghorvak fought with everything, not skill, not precision, but sheer monstrous will. Every swing a challenge, every scream a denial. "You do not burn me," he bellowed. He swung once, twice. The third cut tore. The spirit cracked. Its form shimmered, flickered, tore apart, the green fire unraveling like a thread pulled too tight. It burst with a final cry, a nova of emerald light that bathed the ruin in brilliance. Then silence. Smoke curled skyward. The fire gone, the temple quiet. Only Ghorvak remained standing, shoulders heaving, one eye locked on the path beyond. The others rose slowly, broken but breathing. Behind the ruin, the forest had changed. The trees bent backward, as if in recoil. The moss shriveled. The shadows deepened. The way was open now. The warden waited. Chapter 16. The Verdant Warden. It began with silence. Not the kind that settles after violence, not the hush of reverence or mourning. This silence was deeper, ancient. Its smothered sound like a shroud, muffled breath and heartbeat alike. Even the birds, who had watched the Ghorramor herd with wary eyes since the forest's edge, had fled. There were no insects, no wind, no rustle of leaves, only stillness. The trees opened into a vast hollow, unnaturally wide, unnaturally perfect. No branches reached across it, no roots dared to cross its floor. It was as if the forest itself had drawn back, revealing its heart. And there, at its center, stood Vrrangal, the Verdant Warden. He was immense. Taller than the trees that had birthed him, his body was a fusion of bark and bone, root and ruin, limbs like cathedral pillars, fingers clawed and knotted, dripping with sap thick as tar. His legs were gnarled trunks, each step groaning like tectonic plates shifting. From his shoulders rose a mantle of moss and crow-haunted boughs, and nestled in his chest was a glowing knot, the seed of the forest, pulsing like a second sun. His face was a mask of fury and time. Hollow eyes, wide as shields, burned with amber hate. His mouth was not lips, but a jagged split down his bark skull, through which came no words, only the sound of the forest itself. A windless moan, a groan of old things waking, a whisper that crushed reason. The Ghorramor herd froze. Even Crag-Tusk's kin, blood-drenched and madness-fed, stared in awe. Some wept. Some knelt. One Ghor fell to his knees, clutching his face, screaming, "It sees me! It remembers me!" before slamming his head against the earth until his skull caved. But Ghorvak stepped forward. Slow, deliberate. He raised his axe, crusted in centuries of blood, cracked down the center, humming with his own fury. "I remember you too," he growled. Vrrangal moved. It was not fast, but it didn't need to be. One hand came down like a thunderclap, smashing 2 minotaurs into paste, their limbs scattering like thrown bones. Another arm swept sideways, roots lashing from its knuckles, flaying 3 bestigurs in an instant. The warden roared, a sound like a forest burning alive. The battle erupted. Gors charged, howling, blades drawn, eyes wild. Arrows thunked into bark and bounced off. Axes struck deep but stuck. Warriors yanked, screaming into the air as Vrrangal tore them free and broke them. Limbs pulled from sockets, spines ripped out in long, wet strands. Morgruk summoned storms of shadow, his voice cracking, blood pouring from his nose and ears. Lightning of black fire struck the warden's chest, but the spirit tree simply raised a hand and extinguished the magic, like smoke snuffed between fingers. Ghorvak reached him. Their eyes met, beast and god. Then Ghorvak leapt, driving his axe into Vrrangal's leg. The blade sank deep, severing a vein of glowing sap. Vrrangal reeled, for the first time since the battle began. Roots burst from the wound like enraged serpents, wrapping around Ghorvak's arms, pulling him back. He roared, tore free, flesh ripped from bone, blood sprayed. He struck again, and again. Each blow was answered. Vrrangal swatted him with one arm, sending him flying across the hollow. He crashed through a tree, splintering it, rolling to a stop in a crater of his own making. Bones cracked, ribs shattered. He stood, coughing blood, teeth hanging by threads, and charged again. The herd followed his fury. Beastmen climbed Vrrangal's legs, stabbing, clawing, screaming. Many were crushed, some impaled, but they distracted him long enough for Ghorvak to reach the chest. He saw it, the seed, the glowing core. He leapt, axe raised. Vrrangal caught him. A root speared through Ghorvak's thigh, lifting him high. Another wrapped around his chest, squeezing. Bones popped. His eye dimmed. But he smiled. With one hand he pulled the thorn trial's seed from his belt, the black heart of the grove, and drove it into the warden's chest. The scream was not sound, it was sensation. The forest reeled. Vrrangal staggered. Cracks split his bark. The glowing seed in his chest flared, then burst, sap exploding in all directions like molten blood. Warriors burned. Trees died. The air ignited with green fire. And Ghorvak fell, still holding the axe, still alive. The Verdant warden fell with him, our god of the woods, toppling like a felled monument. Earth shattered, trees bowed, the air groaned with its death. And when it ended, when the silence returned, Ghorvak stood over the corpse, bleeding, barely breathing, but standing. The forest no longer whispered. It wept. Chapter 17. Doom of the Horned. The earth had split. Where once stood the heart of the forest, there now yawned a chasm of steaming roots, blackened soil and writhing decay. The corpse of Vrrangal, the Verdant warden, lay half-consumed by the crater, its bark flesh torn, limbs crumpled in grotesque angles, green fire still leaking from the gaping wound in its chest like divine. But the forest had not died with it. It screamed. A wave of anguish and fury rolled through the trees, a gale of howls and groans that bent trunks and burst branches. The air warped, the sky pulsed with pulses of verdant light, auroras of madness. The wind carried the voices of every lost spirit, every broken root, every silenced grove. The forest was mourning and avenging. It came with no form, only fury. Roots surged from beneath the ground, not as tendrils now, but as lances, barbed and gnarled. They exploded upward beneath the feet of the gory Mar herd, impaling gores and hurling them skyward like rag dolls flung by unseen hands. One Bestiger tried to flee, but the ground opened beneath him, swallowing him whole with a wet gulp. The trees attacked. Limbs twisted into claws, slashing, grabbing, crushing. Bark peeled back to reveal jagged mouths that bit and tore. Crows rained from the skies, not birds, but black-feathered spirits, their beaks alight with fire, their talons dragging flesh from bone. Cragtusk's kin fought valiantly, howling, charging into the storm of living wood, but they were outmatched. Minotaurs were split by roots that struck like spears. One bull, towering and maddened, was pulled apart limb by limb, each severed chunk devoured by the forest floor. And through it all, Ghorvak stood. Hurriedly, his body was ruined, his left arm a mangled mess of torn muscle, his thigh speared through with a broken branch, his jaw shattered, leaving his words slurred and bloodied. But his eye still burned, still glared. The axe was gone, lost somewhere beneath the warden's corpse. But Ghorvak clawed his way across the wreckage, dragging his broken frame toward the heart of the crater. Behind him, Morgruk limped through the carnage, robes torn, face scorched, but still alive, muttering prayers to gods who weren't listening. The warden's body twitched. Ghorvak froze. Its chest heaved, once, weakly, then collapsed. A shudder ran through the roots around it. The light in its chest dimmed, then extinguished, a sun finally swallowed by shadow. It was dead, truly, utterly dead. But the forest still fought, because it was no longer about vengeance. It was rejection. Ghorvak had broken something sacred, and now the forest was vomiting him out like poison. He rose to his feet, one leg useless, ribs splintered, breath ragged, but upright. He bellowed. Not a war cry, not a challenge, a curse. "Is this what your god dies for?" he roared, voice thick with blood and fury. "To protect a cage? To feed on fear?" He spat at the forest, blood and bile and teeth. "I am no beast. I am no servant. I am wrath." The forest shuddered. A single root lunged, impaling Ghorvak through the stomach. He staggered, coughed, then grabbed the root with both hands and ripped it free. The wound gushed, but he did not fall. He turned to his herd, what remained, scattered, broken, dying, and yet watching. He raised the root like a banner high above his head. "Let them remember this day," he growled, voice low and cracked. "Not for gods, not for glory, but for defiance." The forest did not stop, but it did retreat, its wrath subsiding like the tide drawn from the shore. The roots sank back into the earth. The trees fell still, and the silence returned, not of fear, but of finality. The virgin warden was dead, but the cost had been everything. Chapter 18. Shattered Root, Shattered Horn. The crater stank of god blood, that bitter, cloying sap, thicker than tar, luminous as emerald fire, leaked from the shattered remains of the verdant warden, Vrrangal. It pooled beneath his chest, soaking into the roots he once commanded, staining the forest floor with divine filth. The air trembled, as if the trees no longer knew how to breathe without his will pressing upon them. Ghorvak limped across the ruin, one hand pressed against the ragged wound in his side. His entrails swayed with each step, a curtain of viscera exposed to the open air. His eye wept blood. His jaw hung loose, fractured where the warden's final thrash had caved it in. But he walked. He walked as only those who should be dead can walk, on the brittle legs of rage alone. Morgruk followed in silence, barely upright, one arm fused with scorched bark from a failed spell. His mouth was split, his voice gone. Only his breath rasped in and out, dragging pain behind it. They reached the corpse. Vrrangal's skull, large as a siege tower, tilted to one side, its gaping mouth locked in eternal defiance. One hand was crushed beneath his own falling weight. The other reached outward, fingers clawed toward the canopy, as if in the throes of some final curse. Ghorvak climbed it. Each step onto the bark sent fresh blood down his leg. Roots pulsed under his boots, twitching like dying nerves. He reached the top, stood upon the warden's chest, and surveyed the glade. Smoke drifted upward in lazy curls. The bodies of beastmen lay everywhere. Horns snapped, limbs torn free, spines shattered. The soil was churned mud, rich with blood. Goors lay in piles, their faces contorted in fury even in death. Minotaurs bled out against trees. Besiegers knelt, no longer praying but simply waiting. Waiting for a word. Ghorvak raised his head to the skies, and something broke. It wasn't a bone, it wasn't the ground, it was his horn, the last one. Already splintered from battle, it cracked straight through the base, hanging for a breath, and fell. It hit the ground with a dull thud. He stared at it. The last mark of his power, of his identity, gone, his namesake shattered. Ghorvak One-Horn was now Ghorvak none. He should have felt shame. He didn't. Instead, he bared his ruined teeth in a grin, smeared with blood and spite. As he was still standing, he screamed. What voice he had left, a raw, bubbling growl that erupted from the pit of his gut and echoed through the trees. It wasn't a cry for glory. It wasn't for the gods. It was for himself. The herd heard it. Those few that remained raised their weapons, howling through broken throats, stamping into the blood-slick soil. Some wept. Some beat their chests with shattered fists. Some, still dying, found enough life to scream their last in answer. Morgruk knelt, and for the first time, not in service, in recognition. There was no longer a horn. There was no longer a symbol, only effect. Ghorvak had faced a god and torn its heart free, and in the whispering hush that followed, the forest watched. Not with hate, not with love, but with the slow, grudging gaze of something that understood and remembered. Chapter 19. The Wrath of Nature. It began with a shudder, a low, deep tremor that rolled through the earth like the breath of a sleeping colossus waking with murder in its chest. Stones shifted, trees creaked, the sky darkened, not from storm, but from sheer pressure. The weight of the forest's gaze turned inward, focused now not on vengeance, but on punishment. Ghorvak looked up. Above him, the canopy began to move, not swaying, not dancing, but writhing. Branches twisted together, limbs cracked into unnatural angles. The trees were no longer mere watchers. They had become limbs of a mind enraged, a body wounded. The forest, robbed of its warden, raged. It came not in creatures or spirits, but in reclamation. Vines surged across the battlefield like serpents unleashed. Thorns erupted from the soil in barbed clusters, spearing corpses and dragging them back into the earth. The blood-soaked soil drank, hungrily. Gorse, some wounded, others crawling for breath, were snatched by roots that coiled around their necks and pulled. A Bestigor screamed as tendrils forced their way into his mouth, down his throat, and split his chest from the inside. The dead were not enough. It wanted the living. Cragtusk's remaining kin tried to rally, forming a wall of shields and snarls, but the trees fell on them like guillotines. Branches whipped down with the speed of thunderclaps, smashing skulls, ripping flesh, shattering bone like dry kindling. One warrior, impaled through the back, laughed as he died, his madness finally overcome by awe. Mogrik staggered through the chaos, chanting, spitting, bleeding. He raised his staff to the skies, calling on gods who had long since stopped listening. Black lightning streaked upward, only to vanish in midair as the heavens sealed. The light above grew green and dark, glowing like bile. Then the trees rose. Not all, just some. The oldest, the largest. They did not walk, they shifted. Their trunks split, reshaped, formed limbs, faces, hands. Not true Treeman, but something older, primordial. The Rathkin, born not of soul, but of reaction, of trauma, of fury, elemental in form. One lashed its roots through a dozen warriors in one sweep, lifting them into the air and slamming them into the warden's carcass. The broken bodies stuck there, writhing like maggots on meat. Ghorvak didn't flinch. He watched his warband die, his herd, torn down not by warriors, not by spirit, but by the forest's unthinking, unforgiving, immune response. And still he didn't run. He stood in the eye of the storm, the snapped stump of his horn bleeding down his face, his axe lost, his body ruined. He didn't speak. He howled, a final, monstrous, wordless cry, a refusal. Nature had judged him, and now it sought to bury its shame. The Rothan charged, massive, bramble-skinned, bark-toothed. Ghorvak waited. Then he ran, straight at it. He didn't try to dodge. He threw himself into its core, slamming shoulder first against a trunk-like limb. The impact crushed ribs, broke his arm. But he climbed, screamed, tore. He grabbed a twisted, burning vine and bit down, ripping it free with his teeth. Sap exploded across his chest. He shoved the thorned end into what passed for its face. The creature screamed, and stumbled, and fell with him. Ghorvak hit the ground beneath him. Not with grace, with finality. Bones snapped. The breath left him in a red mist. And still, he laughed. A wet, choking laugh. Because, as he lay beneath the broken Rathkin, barely breathing, body ruined, he saw the forest stop. Not in victory, not in defeat, but in realization that what it had tried to destroy, this hornless, scarred beast, had never knelt, not once, not even to nature itself. Chapter 20. The Last Roar. The sky had turned black, not from nightfall, not from storm, but from morning, from ash and rot and the breath of dying gods. The canopy above had gone still, frozen mid-motion, every branch etched in silhouette against a lightless void. 1,000 eyes, leaf, root, and beast alike, watched, as Ghorvak One-Horn lay in the muck, half buried beneath the splintered carcass of a fallen Rathkin, his body shattered like a dropped idol. Bones jutted through torn muscle, his left leg bent in 3 impossible places. His hornless head lay tilted back, mouth half open, leaking blood and laughter in equal measure. His eye still burned. Mogrik knelt beside him. The Bray shaman was no longer whole. His jaw hung loose, his fingers stripped to blackened bone from channeling forces beyond mortal grasp. His eyes, blind or perhaps unwilling to see, stared not at the trees, but at Ghorvak. Only Ghorvak. They'll sing of this. He rasped, voice brittle as dried skin. Ghorvak coughed, a laugh, a curse. It came out as a bubbling hiss. "No songs," he growled, or tried to. "Only echoes." And from the depths of the glade, Vrrangal stirred. Not in body, its corpse remained broken, rotting, bled dry, but the will that had birthed it, the ancient spite of the forest, crawled from the roots in one last desperate surge. It rose not as beast, but as wind, as wrath, as an incorporeal scream of all that had been lost. It struck like a hurricane. The air imploded. Trees splintered. The forest howled. The force slammed into Ghorvak's chest, lifting his broken body into the air like a puppet on strings. His limbs flailed, blood sprayed in arcs, bones cracked anew, his jaw split, his ribs shattered. The light in his eye dimmed. It blazed, brighter than ever. He roared, the final roar. No words, no challenge, just fury, pure, raw, the essence of defiance given voice. The shock waves shattered the trees around him. The scream of one hornless Beastlord met the scream of an entire forest and overpowered it. The will of Athel Loren broke. The wind scattered. The roots recoiled. The corpse of Vrrangal collapsed into rot, as if even its memory could no longer withstand that final act of rebellion. Ghorvak fell. The earth cracked beneath him, welcoming its greatest enemy like a throne forged in pain. Silence fell. No breath stirred. No beast moved. The four stood, humbled. The few surviving beastmen, scarred, burnt, blood-drunk, formed a ring around their chieftain. Not close, not reaching, they did not dare. They watched and waited. Ghorvak dragged himself forward. He knelt beside Ghorvak's body, pressed his clawed hand to the chest. Still, and still. Then, one breath. A wheeze. A rasp. Ghorvak's mouth moved. Barely. The sound was almost nothing, but they all heard it. Tell them. Ghorvak leaned closer. Ghorvak's lips peeled back and the ghost of a grin. Tell the forest I won. And then he was gone. No blaze of glory, no thunderclap, just stillness. The Beastlord lay in silence, hornless, lifeless, undefeated. Above him, the trees began to bloom. Not in celebration, not in joy, in remembrance. The forest would heal, but it would never forget, because somewhere in its roots, etched in the marrow of Athel Loren itself, Ghorvak's name would always echo,